Right at the very start of the Gospel of Matthew, the author hands us this fascinating little literary puzzle. So let's dive in and see if we can crack it together.
So here's the central question. Why give one person two different names, Jesus and Immanuel? Now you gotta understand, Matthew isn't being sloppy or forgetful here. No way. He's being incredibly intentional. These two names, they aren't a contradiction. They're actually the two essential clues we need to unlock the central message of his entire book.
Okay, so our first clue comes from the name he was actually called, in his day-to-day life, Jesus. And this name, it tells us pretty much everything we need to know about his purpose, about his mission.
So the name Jesus, it's the Greek version of the Hebrew name Yeshua. And what it means is incredibly direct. Yahweh saves. This isn't just some nice-sounding name, it's practically a job description. And Matthew doesn't even make us guess at the meaning. He tells us flat out. An angel says, you are to give him the name Jesus because he will save his people from their sins. See? The name and the mission are perfectly woven together. And we really can't overstate just how radical of a claim this was for a first-century audience. Scholars point out that all throughout the Hebrew Bible, saving people from sin is something only God does. It was a divine prerogative, reserved for Yahweh and Yahweh alone. So to say this human being was going to do it, that was a truly profound, even shocking statement. So let's just pause here and sum up our first clue. The name Jesus is all about his function, his life's work, his mission. It basically identifies him as the agent of God's salvation, someone who is performing an act of uniquely divine authority.
All right, time for our second clue. That prophetic name, Immanuel. Now, if the name Jesus tells us what he does, well, Immanuel is about to tell us who he is. Immanuel is also a Hebrew name, Immanuel, and its meaning is just as straightforward, but maybe even more profound. It means, quite literally, God with us. And just like before, Matthew makes absolutely sure we don't miss the point. He quotes the ancient prophet Isaiah, and then immediately tacks on his own little parenthetical, spelling it right out for us, which means God with us. He really wants us to get this. Now, scholars across the board agree that for Matthew, this is not just a symbolic title. It's not like calling someone a rock because they're steady. This is meant to be a direct statement about his essential nature, his core identity. It's a claim that he is the embodied presence of God. And this just nails the second half of our puzzle, doesn't it? The name Immanuel reveals his identity, his very being. It marks him as the divine presence, the fulfillment of this ancient, long-held hope that God would one day return to dwell personally among his people. Okay, so we've got our two clues. One is all about mission, the other is all about identity. So now let's put them together and finally solve Matthew's puzzle. And here it is, laid out as clearly as possible. The name Jesus, Yahweh saves, tells us what he does. That's his mission. The name Immanuel, God with us, tells us who he is. That's his identity. They're like two sides of the very same coin, each one revealing a different but absolutely essential aspect of who he is. The scholar David Capes actually gives us some great language for this. He helps us see the difference between function and ontology. Think of it this way. Function is what someone does, while ontology is who someone fundamentally is. So the name Jesus points to his function, the work of salvation, or soteriology. And the name Immanuel points to his ontology, the reality of God in flesh, the incarnation. Matthew is brilliantly merging these two huge ideas. And this, right here, this leads us to Matthew's grand central claim. The two names aren't just parallel facts sitting next to each other. No, they are causally linked. His mission is only possible because of his identity. He can save his people from their sins precisely because he is God with us. But you might be asking, why does this matter so much? Well, to really get that, we have to zoom out and look at the bigger biblical story. A framework from the theologian Tim Mackey is super helpful here. This isn't just about one person. It's about the entire human story. You can actually read the whole biblical narrative as the story of God's presence. So it starts in Eden, right? God's presence is just dwelling freely with humanity. Then comes exile,
a painful separation from that presence. For centuries after that, God's presence is sort of localized in this very limited way, first in the tabernacle and then the temple. And then Matthew makes this stunning announcement. With Immanuel, that presence has fully and finally returned, and not in a building, but in a person. And this brings us to the ultimate point, the massive implication here. The name Immanuel is nothing less than the announcement that humanity's long exile from God's presence is finally over. That separation that started way back in Eden, it's being reversed. Now watch how masterfully Matthew structures his entire book around this one single idea. Scholars like Michael Bird have pointed out that he creates this incredible narrative frame. He begins his gospel right here in chapter 1 with the promise of Immanuel, God with us. So how does he end it, the entire book? With the very last words from the resurrected Jesus. And surely I am with you always, to the very end of the age. It's incredible. The gospel starts and ends with the exact same promise. This whole theme of God's presence is the bracket that holds the entire story together. Which leaves us with this one last thought to ponder. For Matthew, the two names, Jesus and Immanuel, they reveal that the mission of salvation is accomplished through the reality of divine presence. And it really prompts us to ask ourselves, what does it mean for the entire human story if its central claim is that God's ultimate, deepest plan was simply to be with us?